Hey guys, Booty Bay from Nada here, and today I'm going to be doing a guide for Restoration Druid in 8.1.5. So there's a couple things that we need to cover first, are the nerfs and the buffs that happened post 8.1. First, Tranquility was nerfed, the direct healing was nerfed by 10%, and the heal over time effect was nerfed by 40%. It was pretty overpowered, so it's a justified change, I guess. And we got a couple of buffs to help soften the blow of that. We got a buff to Wild Growth, which increased the healing by 10%, and also its mana cost was reduced by 7%. Life Bloom also got a 7% mana cost reduction, and Efflorescence got a 15% healing increase. And finally, the Wild Charge ability was taken off of the GCD. I mean, the Tranquility nerf was a bit of a pain, but realistically it was pretty overpowered, especially in non-raid content. As for the change for the GCD, I couldn't improve more. It was a very welcome change. Not being able to charge after I do a heal if I need to move is not good. The other buffs as well to the spells was really welcome change because it helped soften the blow of the nerf to Tranquility, so it's all good. Next we're going to be covering the builds and talents for Restoration Druid. Currently there's a meta, there's about two different builds that are being used in the high level Mythic Plus community, and all around in the Mythic Plus community. Resto Druid has two main builds. There's the Photosynthesis build and the Germination build currently. I prefer the Photosynthesis build myself, but you can also take the Germination build, and there's not really going to be all that many. There's not going to be any serious problems. It's not going to ruin your key if you choose the wrong spec. The Photosynthesis build is more standard, and it focuses more on higher single target healing requirements, and it gives you a little bit more free. It's more GDC efficient, so your global cooldown. So you don't have to spend as many global cooldowns to heal, and you can spend them doing DPS otherwise to help the dungeon get through faster. As for the Germination build, it focuses a little bit more on the AoE healing aspect for like pretty bad debuffs on the raid, for example, like Grievous and Bursting, so that you can heal up everybody a little bit easier. As for certain things, I mean, for your 30 talent tier, it doesn't really matter that much. It's kind of down to personal preference. Renewal is not usually a meta talent. It's not used as often because it's only used if you don't need to be as mobile, and most of the time in Mythic Pluses you're moving a lot. But if you're not really comfortable with Resto Druid, Renewal is also a good thing to use to get that extra healing, so you don't have to worry about yourself quite as much. Another thing I would recommend is if you're new to the class, I would not pick up Feral Affinity. Feral Affinity is used mostly to do extra damage because your damage dealt in the cap form with Feral Affinity tends to be a lot higher than if you were just casting spells in your downtime. But if you're not comfortable, or if you're newer to the spec, I would recommend using Guardian Affinity instead because it reduces your damage taken, and it also gives you access to Frenzied Regeneration, which is a pretty heavy heal. If you take damage, for example, and you don't need to heal everybody really quickly, you could just swap into bear form and then hit Frenzied Regen, and it'll do a nice amount of healing. So that way you don't have to spend too many GCDs doing that. The downside, of course, is that you have to stay in bear form in order for Frenzied Regen to continue healing, but it is pretty nice. As far as other utility cooldowns, I would recommend to keep Typhoon. Mass Entanglement and Mighty Bash have their niches and their ability to be used every once in a while, but for the most part, Typhoon is better. As far as your utility in Mythic Plus, Resto Druid, the utility that Resto Druid brings is half the reason that you bring a Resto Druid for a Mythic Plus, because you have spells like Ursul's Vortex, which slows anything that's inside of it, and then will also pull it back to the location of the vortex itself, which can be very helpful in kiting ads. For example, in Necrotic Weeks, you can use Ursul's Vortex to slow the mobs that are chasing the tank so that the tank can drop the necrotic stacks. Typhoon, like I said, can also be used it can be used to slow targets and also push them away, and it can be used in combination with Ursul's Vortex to get everything stacked up in one place, and then somebody can AoE stun it. Entangling Roots is a really helpful tool for all kinds of different reasons. For example, on the last boss of Freehold, the Resto Druid, or any Druid, can actually Entangling Roots the add that spawns, and then you don't have to worry about it at all. And then Soothe is a big one. You can use Soothe to drop the enrage effects during raging weeks so that you don't have to worry about the extra damage that the mobs will do when they enrage. As far as your Azerite traits, we're moving on to Azerite traits. As far as choosing an Azerite trait, there's a lot of different traits you can take, just like in every other class. And I'm not going to give all the options and rake them here. If you really want to find them, there's plenty of places like Icy Veins that you can find an actual ranked list of traits. But for Mythic Plus specifically, you want to aim for getting 1 Grove trending. Any higher than that is going to... 1 Grove trending trait is very powerful, but the subsequent 2nd and 3rd, if you get more than 1, are much weaker and will not really benefit as much as getting a different trait. The Grove trending causes your Swiftmen to apply a heal over time effect, which stacks with your Mastery, because your Mastery will increase the healing taken by the target based on how many heal over time effects are on that target. Your next traits the next 3 traits you'll want to aim for, like secondary stat procs like Trade Winds, Endless Hunger, and Insight the Pack. Those are very good talents. I think I use Trade Winds as well on one of mine. I do. And then I also use Blightborn Infusion because that's what I got. And for your finals 2 slots, it's a little bit more flexible, but I would recommend using DPS traits such as Power of the Moon, High Noon, or Bonded Souls to be able to get a little bit extra DPS out to help the team down certain bosses or trash to get through the dungeon quicker. As far as your stat priority, your stats are kind of going to fall. Mastery and Haste are pretty equal in Mythic Plus, and then its crit is a little better than Versatility. Sometimes it kind of depends. If you're not really interested in min-maxing, if you're new to healing, or you don't really care all that much about stats all that much, you just kind of want to heal and have fun, I would recommend just kind of just equip the highest eye level items, because for the most part, thankfully, Resto Druid doesn't have to worry too much about stats because most of your secondary stats are pretty equal. Intellect is obviously the highest stat, and that will decrease over the expansion, and near the end of the expansion, secondary stats will start to take over Intellect as far as weights. But like I said, if you don't really care that much, I would just kind of more look for the higher eye level items. And I would count sockets as about 10 to 15 eye levels, so a 350 item with a socket would be about equal to a 365 one that doesn't have a socket, give or take, kind of depending on the item. Now, if you're more interested in getting optimal with your stat weights and priorities and such, I would recommend getting Healer stat weights. It is this add-on right here that I have in the corner, and what it does is it actually will give you weights based on how you perform as a healer. Which means if you aren't healing correctly, it will give you stats based on not healing correctly, so that while you're not healing correctly, you will still be improving based on stat weights. And if you are healing correctly, it'll give you the stat weights based on healing correctly, and you'll still heal better. So either way, you're improving because it gives you the stat weights based on how you play. So for example, at the same time, for boss fights, for example, that do a lot of single target damage to one target, your Mastery is going to have a higher weight at the end of the fight. But if it's a fight where there is more AoE more AoE damage to the whole party, your haste will probably have a slightly higher value, maybe give or take equal sometimes. It kind of depends. But it is a very powerful add-on for any healer to have, even if you're not a Resto Druid. Any other healer, I would recommend taking that add-on. And also, at the same time, I would recommend getting Pawn as well. Pawn allows you to input stat weights to your items, and then it will give you a value for the item, so that way you can use the stat weights you got from your healer stat weights add-on and input into Pawn. Just simply in the game, you type /pawn after it's on, and it will have, you can set your weights, and for an example, I guess I will put on a piece of gear and show you what it does. So based on my stats, I put that on, and it says that this item is for my Mythic Plus, my current Mythic Plus, it's 30% upgrade over the item I just put on. Pretty easy. That way you don't have to do all the math yourself. For gems and enchants, I would go with your highest stat weight item. So if Mastery is your highest stat weight, which it probably will be for Mythic Plus, I would go with Mastery. Like I keep Mastery gems and enchants in my inventory at all times. I just stock up because the Mastery is typically my highest stat. If I'm raiding, it's usually going to be haste. But for Mythic Plus, yeah, it's more than likely going to be Mastery. Add-ons. One of the things that you really need to go for is good raid frames. You can do it with the Blizzard UI. The Blizzard UI is okay for raid frames. I mean, it doesn't have as much customization, and a lot of the things that you need are in the wrong places. You can move your character frame and the target frame and your raid frames a little bit, but for the most part, it's not very customizable, but the Blizzard UI for the raid frames will work, but I recommend getting something more like Grid or Voodoo, or even LVUI, which is what I use. I use LVUI for an overall UI change. So everything on my screen here you see that's just all LVUI. And then my raid frames, you can't see them right now, but I recommend getting a raid frame add-on. Another add-on I would recommend getting is Weak Ores and Tell Me When, or Tell Me When, I should say. It's pointless to get both, but they will. What Weak Ores or Tell Me When will do, they have many customization options that help you keep track of cooldown timers, abilities, boss mechanics, etc. You have to do a little bit of the work yourself, but as for my Tell Me Whens, I'll show you. I have a couple. Once they load up here, this is a cast bar. You can have that on your basic frames. I just have it here on my Tell Me Whens. This is a bit of an advanced UI for Tell Me When, but it's pretty simple. Once you actually, you don't have to set it up very complicated. It just kind of depends on how you're doing it. I will show you. I'll go get in combat with one of these target dummies, and I'll show you what it kind of shows up as. For me, it keeps track of my Vortex, my Wild Growth, my Swift Mend, Nature's Cure, Ironbark, Innervate, my Racial Berserking, Cenarian Ward, Tranquility, and a couple other abilities, but they don't show up if I'm not using them. And then I have my mana bar, and then these are the timers for my Efflorescence and my Life Bloom. So if I put my Efflorescence down, it'll show a timer. If I put my Life Bloom on, it'll show a timer. If I use my Wild Growth, it'll put it on a cooldown, etc. Shows it for everything. So Ironbark, Ursul's Vortex, Berserking, Cenarian Ward, etc. All of my cooldowns, if I use them, they will go on a timer. It's a very nice add-on to have. That way you can keep track of cooldowns and not have to worry about so much about having your action bars in your face. That way you can have just a couple of add-ons here, and that's very nice. Finally, I would recommend getting a good boss mod add-on. Like Deadly Boss Mobs or Bigwigs is perfectly fine. I personally prefer Bigwigs because it's a little bit quieter than Deadly Boss Mods. But realistically, both are perfectly fine. They're both very well kept up and always up to date when the next raid encounter or dungeons come out. Macros. I can give you a couple macros that I use. Typically, you don't need a whole lot of macros. A lot of people will like to use mouse over macros. and mouse over macros are perfectly fine. You just have a mouse over macro and you mouse over and you press the spell and it will use it. I personally don't have very many. The only mouse over macro I have is my Nature's Cure, and it will cure the target that I mouse over, and then my Entangling Roots for enemy targets. But I will give you an example of some of them I use. For example, I have Mass Root, Mass Entanglement as a mouse over. Just to make it a little bit easier, that way you don't have to target. Same with my Entangling Roots, I have that as a mouse over as well, so that way you can just mouse over Entangling Roots the target of your choosing, so that way you don't have to worry about targeting that instead of a heal target that you're trying to keep alive. So I just come over here, not targeted on anything, and I just cast my Entangling Roots, and it will put a root on the target that is immune. That one, I mean. Another one I use is Self-Cast Innervate, so that way, no matter who I'm targeted on, my Innervate will always cast on myself. Because as a Resto Druid, I am selfish, and I do not want to give my Innervate to anybody else. So it's very nice to just be able to keep Innervate for myself, so I don't have to cast on anybody else. It's perfect. Another one that is very handy to use is a Wild Charge macro. You just cast it. You press it twice and it will cast a sequence to do Tribal Form and then Wild Charge. I don't have that one on my bars currently, but I will show you here. And you don't need to use it. I mean, realistically, if you have Wild Charge somewhere on your bars, like I have it on 5, I actually don't use it anymore, but you can still use it if you really want to. It's pretty easy to do. One that is really helpful is the Travel Cat macro, which will cast. It will cast your cat form if you are indoors, but if you are not indoors, it will instead cast Travel Form. So that way, you can maximize the amount of mobility that you have at any given moment. So right now it shows as cat. I will hit it, and it will turn me into cat form. And as soon as I go outside, the icon changes, and it turns me to Travel Form instead. Once it realizes I'm outside, there we go. It's a very nice macro, very handy to have, I would think. And then when you go back inside, you just have to recast, of course. But it's a very handy macro. It keeps you pretty mobile. That way you don't have to worry too much. And that way you don't have to have both on your bars if you don't want to. And finally, we get to trinkets and gear. As far as your best in slot gear, I don't really have a list. I mean, realistically, your best in slot gear is whatever is the best stats for you. So I would recommend having the healer stat weights and your pawn, and keeping track of your stat weights and updating your stat weights constantly based on what your healer stat weight says, and then keep a lookout for gear that has better stats. So for example, if your stat weights give priority to mastery, then haste, then crit, then verse, then you're probably going to be wanting to look for pieces that have haste and mastery, and some crit maybe, depending on how close the stats are. But for the most part, your secondary stats are going to be pretty closely weighted for most content. So overall, getting a higher eye level upgrade's probably going to be an upgrade in some cases, depending on what you're doing. As far as your trinkets, there's a couple of top trinkets that you're going to be looking for Mythic Dungeons. One of them is the Sinister's Gladiator Insignia. You get that one from PvP. Unfortunately, if you don't like PvP, it's not a must-have, but it is a pretty good trinket to have. Another good one is the Mirror of the Entwined Fate, and that one drops off King Rosticon, all difficulties, in the Battle of Drazar Lore. The other one is the Ignition Mage's Fuse from Tol Dagor. That will drop on all difficulties, but I would recommend getting a Mythic Plus version, unless you're not very geared. Either way, a 340 for somebody who is average eye level 380 is not going to be very good, but if you get a high eye level 1, that's one of your best in slot trinkets. Other top contenders include the Ward of Envelopment, which drops off of the first boss in Drazar Lore, the Incandescent Sliver from Opulence. Another good one is the Sea Giant's Tidestone. That one you get from the Tortolan Emissaries. If you get a good roll on that, it's a good trinket. Like I currently have a pretty good roll on mine, 385 with a trinket. could be better, but also could be worse. The Drust Runed Icicle from the Hailstone Construct World Boss can be good, except its base eye level is 355, so in order to get you would have to get a good roll for it to actually be good. And the same thing with the Moonstone of Zinizjare, which is also a Tortolan Emissary reward. That is also it's also an Emissary reward, so it doesn't have a high eye level drop. So it's typically only good if you get a high roll on it. And that's pretty much it for the trinkets and the gear. My last bit of advice is, if you're new to healing or just new to the game, or either way, if you still don't have keybinds, keybinds are a big one. There are add-ons like Voodoo and Healbot, I believe is what it's called, which will allow you to set certain clicks when you click on the raid frames to just automatically use a specific heal, like left click is this heal, right click is this heal, mouse wheel is this heal, control click, etc. And that can be useful, but then for all your other abilities, if you don't use keybinds, I highly recommend it. When I first started getting into keybinds, I only used like 2 or 3. I used T and F were my first 2 keybinds I ever used. You don't have to start with all of the keybinds that you see on my screen here, like all these. That's not even a lot, actually, compared to what I've seen in the past. But if you don't have keybinds yet and you're uncomfortable with the idea, just try 1 or 2 different spells, put them on a keybind. Make sure there's something you use often. Like, for example, if you're a warrior, put it on a stun. You know, all your abilities on the 1 through equal, and then put your stun on a keybind and put your charge on a keybind. And then the more you use the keybind to use the spell or ability, the more you'll get comfortable with using keybinds, and you can keep adding more. It's big. If you don't use keybinds, I recommend it. Just start using small amounts of keybinds and just try. And trust me, you'll see a difference. When I started using keybinds, I saw a difference. So that's my last recommendation for you. I guess that's it for my Druid guide. If what I have reviewed here helped you, give me a like, subscribe. I'll have more content in the future. I'll be doing Mythic Plus guides in the future. I may even move on to doing more classes, the guides for more classes in the future, maybe more specs. And if there's something that I did in the video that isn't correct or is no longer relevant, for example, if something changes, put it in the comments and I'll address it, make sure. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.